Still a little here in Chesterfield, Romania. We will get back into Daniel chapter 11. And I'm going to do some recapping here. I've been doing a lot of studying and just so much rich history in this chapter. Some of it's direct and some of it's more indirect with it, but do want to cover some interesting things that I've come across. These are accounts, a lot of them are not in a lot of your commentaries for a good reason. Most people don't, I guess, have the love of history that I do. And some choose to, and rightly so, focus more on the prophecy. And as I've said before, I don't intend to ignore the prophecy. It is important. But because there's so much out there already on the prophetic things, I kind of like to touch on the interesting things of history. A lot of people more capable than I am, at getting into the prophetic things. But like I say, I'm not going to skip over those. I've studied that out too. And so I wanted to start out going back to Cyrus, where it talks early in the chapter, start of chapter 11, about the four kings. Three kings at first, and then the fourth would be far richer than they all. And so I wanted to center on Cyrus was the start of that, and then his son Cambyses inherited the empire from him upon Cyrus's death, and we talked about his death and the controversy there. There's also a lot of controversy about Cambyses. Cambyses, some people seem to think he was insane, and others, didn't seem to think so. He did, said, married two of his sisters, and then ended up murdering one, and may have murdered his younger brother before he left on his campaign to bring Egypt back into the realm, which I suppose probably revolted after the death of Cyrus. A lot of times that's the opportune time to do things like that when you see a change of leadership. And so Cambyses was to go down and bring Egypt back in and retake Egypt for the empire of Persia. But and some say that he murdered his brother and then put in an impostor before he left, that when he came back then he would take back over. But regardless of whether that was what happened or whether he put his brother in rule until his return, and then his brother was murdered by someone else, and it was an impostor. Either way, Cambyses heard of the revolt and headed back. But before then, as he went into Egypt to retake it, it should have been I don't know if you'd say easy victory, but they certainly had the advantage because Pharaoh had died. The Pharaoh had been Pharaoh for a while, and left in his place was a son which was fairly young and inexperienced. So Cambyses saw that as a opportune time to retake the kingdom. And I've already had to do this redo this one time. So if I end up saying Cyrus instead of Cambyses, you know who I'm talking about. I'm talking about Cambyses now, Cyrus' son. He met the forces at a place called Pelusium, and which is known now as the Battle of Pelusium. But he met the Egyptian army there, and the Egyptian army stood their ground. And so Cambyses withdrew his forces, and knowing something about the Egyptians, he knew that they worshiped cats and held them in high veneration, and as they did a lot of animals. So he painted cats, had cats painted on all the shields of his army, and then rounded up all the cats and other animals they could get, I guess. We've talked about herding cats, how difficult that is, impossible. I suppose when you got a whole army, you can herd some, but as they went back into battle and herding all these animals, and with the cat painted on the shields of his soldiers, the Egyptians refused to shoot arrows or otherwise attack the shields of the approaching army. And so and all the animals didn't want to injure them, and so the Egyptian army ended up fleeing for the most part. And so it was a big rout. And so as the battle, I maybe call it the Battle of the Cats instead of the Battles of Pelusium. But so many different ways. We've heard of the Troy horse, the Trojan horse used, and we've heard of Hannibal's elephants, and now you know about the Cambyses cats that he used to overthrow Egypt and bring them back into the rim there. It's speaking about his insanity that some people say he had. Well, that sounded like a pretty smart move, I guess. Insanity sometimes can be taken by whoever's looking at it and how you're looking at it, I suppose. There is a true story that I think it's back in the 70s, where a group of psychologists decided to run an experiment, and they had themselves admitted to different mental institutions just to see, how things were ran and how they'd be evaluated. Well, every single one of them were evaluated as being insane, of having serious mental problems, put on medication, and then actually I think the guy that's the head of it, he couldn't get himself released then. They would, when he tried to tell them who he was and explain things, it took some while till finally he got out of that mental institution. So, insanity sometimes in the eye of the beholder like beauty, I guess. There's also the joke about, somebody maybe heard, that the head of a mental institution that was leaving one day, and as he was walking to his car, walking outside the fence, boarded fence, and but there was a knothole there in the fence, and he could hear on the other side of the fence inside, these guys saying 13, 13, 13, and they're all laughing. He thought, what are these crazy people doing now? And so he puts his eye down there at the knothole, and he gets his eye stuck with a stick, and he jerks back, and then inside there's laughter, wild laughter again, saying 14, 14. So, he's dumb enough to look down there and look in that knothole. And so, anyway, that's, sometimes we have to question who is really crazy and who is not, who's really insane and who's not. Of course, I wonder about also the death of Cyrus. All right. Not Cyrus, again, Cambyses. We talked about that before, that he was on his way back to put down his throne being overtaken by this imposter, whoever it was, and that he had went to mount his horse, and the tip off his scabbard was missing, and somehow, as he mounted his horse, the sword stuck him in the thigh, and he got gangrene and died before he could get back to the capital. And so Darius wrote back and sent word back that he was dead, but not at the hand of man. I forget exactly how he worded it, but that's the essence of what he was saying. But after Darius got back and talked to, and we still don't know absolutely. Darius is the one that wrote the history, which most kings did. But there's some question now, when Darius got back and killed this, was it the imposter that he killed, or was there really revolt? Was this really Cambyses' brother who would have been in line for the throne that they killed. But Darius talked him into, appointing him as king since he was a cousin, and he took over, and he did turn out to be a good king, and expanding the empire and everything, ruled for a long time. But you can't help but think if all this other intrigue going on could have, after the injury to Cambyses and he fell sick, could Darius have maybe been a part of helping that along a little bit? I've never read that possibility, but who knows? Just don't know anymore. At any rate, you look at all these people, and as we go through here, in the rest of the chapter even, all the assassinations, it's amazing. It seemed like more of these kings and even sometimes their families were assassinated or poisoned, one thing and another, way before their time. It's not a very secure position to have. May have been, good while you had it, but wasn't always the best secure position to have. So we'll start on and pick up then with the rest of it. It says in verse 4, it says, "And when he shall stand up, his kingdom," talking about that mighty king, "shall be broken and shall be divided toward the four winds of heaven, and not to his posterity, nor according to his dominion which he ruled. For his kingdom shall be plucked up even for others beside these," or those. Now, the death of Alexander, we talked a little bit about that before, but I've heard the statement most of my life. I was raised in church, and so gone to church most of my life. My dad was a deacon. We went Sunday morning, Sunday night, and Wednesday evening, so I've heard a lot of preaching over the years. And most of what I've heard about Alexander was that he'd conquered all the known world, and when there's nothing left to conquer, he sat down and wept because there's nothing else to conquer, and basically died. That's really not true. I still hear it repeated today, though. While considering the conquest of Carthage and Rome, some accounts say Alexander died of malaria in Babylon. It's now in Iraq, on June the 13th, my birthday, by the way, 323 BC. That was not my birthday. Others have said he likely died from complications from battle injuries and venereal disease, but those may be speculation because of a decadent lifestyle he lived, but very likely. But who knows? It may have been complications from those, plus he had suffered some major injuries during the battle. Alexander wasn't a general that sat back and ordered his troops and watched the war or the battle go on. He engaged in the battle himself and was usually leading the front of his cavalry charge. And so he talked about one time that he was struck in the head with an axe. His helmet protected him, but it did do some injury. It took him a while to get his senses back, but as he stayed in the heat of the battle, which his companions kept him safe during that time, and went right back to fighting. But as an injury, and he had some other severe injuries, so it may have been a combination of a lot of those that caught up to him. But Alexander had conquered India as far as the Ganges River when his army refused to go any farther, and they began to want to mutiny. Now there is even some speculation that his sister Cleopatra of Macedon, not to be confused with the later Cleopatra, who was Cleopatra, I think 7, if I'm not mistaken, or 6 possibly. I have to get into that when we get into it a little later, but still not to be confused with her. She always thought that it's a possibility that Ptolemy the First, one of Alexander's generals, may have poisoned him because a lot of the army was upset with Alexander, because he was beginning to dress in Persian garb, and the Persian rulers had really set themselves up as gods, and so they began to see that in Alexander. Alexander began to take that attitude. So who knows? During his sickness, maybe somebody told him he did take advantage of the situation, go ahead and poison him. There again, there's so many uncertainties, but just another possibility there. He evidently was experienced. Maybe they thought he was going crazy a little bit after all his injuries and fever. I don't know. He had been seriously injured. On the way back, he was received his most serious injury of all. As they returned after the army had about revolted on him, they'd been gone for 3 years, I think, and he was wounded so seriously by Mali warriors of the Punjab region of India that he almost died. His recovery took so long that many of his troops began to think he was dead. The Mali and other tribe had decided not to let Alexander cross their territories on his way back, returned to Greece. And although as normal, Alexander was greatly outnumbered, his expertise and his fierceness in battle soon saw them retreat. That's the enemy, the Malis, the retreat to their double-walled fortress. And after breaching the outer wall, Alexander grew impatient at the progress being made on the inner wall. And having only 2 ladders, Alexander climbed to the top of the wall. And with his soldiers trying desperately to stay with him to protect him, the ladders were overloaded and broke. His soldiers tried to talk Alexander into jumping back down on the outside so they could catch him, but Alexander refused and jumped down on the inside the wall. And once inside the citadel, he killed the Malians' leader, but was then hit with an arrow which penetrated his lung. Alexander's troops thought he was dead and determined to kill everyone in the city out of revenge. And a few of his men placed Alexander in a tent, and finding he was still alive, the arrow had to be cut out. Now, at first, no one wanted to attempt to cut the arrow out because they probably rightly assumed that if the king died, and they're going to be blamed, and it'd probably be their life along with his. But finally, Perdiccas finally came forth and agreed to make the incision and save Alexander's life. And but word had already spread to the main army that Alexander was dead. And then later, when it was reported that he was still alive, they refused to believe it. The count, I think, said that they had put Alexander on a barge or a boat of some kind, had to, he finally had to, when he'd recovered enough that he stand on his feet for a little while, just so his army could see him before they'd believe that he was not dead. And so after his death, though, then that's where the 4 rulers come in that we mentioned at verse 4 talked about, that his kingdom was split into 4 because he had a young son, but the generals agreed to divide the territories up and eventually divide up into 4 territories, and different generals ruled the different areas. Now, it wasn't too long until Ptolemy, the king of the south, that we'll see here in chapter 11, and Seleucus became the more powerful, and they dominated and eventually absorbed these other 2 kingdoms that it's set up in. And so we'll go into verse 5, and we'll go ahead and see what we can cover here a little bit. And it says the king of the south, and this is where a lot of people get lost in, especially in chapter 11. It really does take a lot of knowledge of the history and things that's going on in the past, because most of this down to a point here is history now. As we get into the latter part of the chapter, then we'll get into the prophecy of the future. But Ptolemy I, the king of the south, who ruled over Egypt. Excuse me, let me back up and read the verse 5 there. It says, "And the king of the south shall be strong, and one of his princes and he shall be strong above him, and have dominion. His dominion shall be a great dominion. Now Ptolemy the first, the king of the south, who ruled over Egypt, Palestine, Arabia, and Petria, was assisted by a general named Seleucus. That's one of his princes, talked about in verse 5. It says, and the king of the south shall be strong, and one of his princes. So Seleucus was one of his princes who had originally been given Babylon, but who was later forced out by Antigonus, one of the other generals. And so in the end of years, we go on to verse 6. They shall join themselves together, for the king's daughter of the south shall come to the king of the north to make an agreement, but she shall not retain the power of the arm, neither shall he stand nor his arm. But she shall be given up, and they that brought her, and he that begat her, and he that strengtheneth her in these times. And most time you read that and you say, what? It's a lot in there, but like I say, history helps understand it. This came to pass about 250 BC when Ptolemy II Philadelphus of Egypt, the king of the south, sent his daughter Berenice, the king's daughter of the south, as mentioned in the verse there, to marry Antiochus II Theos in order to make peace with him. And the problem was that Antiochus was already married to Laodice, who he intended to divorce. Laodice found it out and had them both poisoned. Berenice's father, Ptolemy II Philadelphus, died that same year, and that's where you get where it says, he that begat her, and he that strengtheneth her in these times. Where it says, in the latter part, it says, but she shall not retain the power of the arm, neither shall he stand, nor his arm, but she shall be given up, and they that brought her, and he that begat her, that's her father, Ptolemy of Philadelphia, in that same year died. So yeah, it's a little complicated there, and a lot went on with that. And go just a little further here, verse 7 says, but out of a branch of her roots shall one stand up in his estate, which shall come with an army, and shall enter into the fortress of the king of the north, and shall deal against them, and shall prevail, and shall also carry captives into Egypt their gods, with their princes, and with their precious vessels of silver and gold, and he shall continue more years than the king of the north. So the king of the south shall come into his kingdom, and shall return into his own land. So, okay, what's this all about? A branch of her roots. Still talking about Berenice. Shall stand up in his estate. Berenice's brother, Ptolemy the third, is that branch that's talking about. He became king in Egypt and avenged the death of his sister when he invaded the northern Seleucid kingdom and captured its capital, Antioch. Let me say right quickly, to remind you, some of you may know this, the Seleucid kingdom was basically Syria, but it basically involved most of the old Persian Empire. And then the Ptolemaic kingdom empire was basically Egypt. And as I said before, God's people, the Israelites, were caught in the middle. Jerusalem went under control of one or the other, back and forth, depending on who had dominance over the years. Some of the precious vessels he returned were vessels that the Persians had stolen from Egypt a couple of centuries earlier. And so that's all the precious vessels they had taken back. Verse 10, but his son shall be stirred up, and shall assemble a multitude of great forces, and one shall certainly come and overflow and pass through. Then shall he return and be stirred up, even to his fortress. And we see that the two sons of Seleucus II, Seleucus III, Cyrus, and Antiochus III, the Great, countered by continuing to fight the Ptolemies and made it to their fortress in Raphia, southwest of Gaza.